3,800,000 men, 3,350 tanks, 2,770 aircraft, 7,200 artillery pieces. On the crisp, early morning of June 22nd, 1941, the greatest concentration of military destructive power in human history sat idling on the borders of the Soviet Union. The exhaust fumes of thousands of Maybach tank engines choked the dawn air. The artillerymen held the lanyards of their howitzers, waiting for the signal to unleash Operation Barbarossa. Now, freeze that frame, erase it completely. Imagine the order never comes. Imagine Adolf Hitler, in a rare moment of cold, calculating strategic restraint, listens to his naval command, looks at the map, and decides that fighting a two-front war is a fool's errand. What if Germany never invaded the Soviet Union? Could the Third Reich have actually won World War II? Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the steel, the blood, and the logistics of history's greatest conflicts. If you want to understand the brutal mathematics of warfare, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and drop into the comments right now to let me know if you think Britain could have survived an undivided German war machine. To understand the sheer magnitude of this alternate reality, we have to dig deep into the strategic bedrock of Europe in 1941. We have to strip away the hindsight and look at the map exactly as the German High Command saw it. By the summer of 1941, Germany had conquered Poland. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The Swedes were neutral but selling them iron ore. The Spanish were neutral but sympathetic. The Italians were a struggling but active ally. The continent belonged to Berlin. Across the English Channel, the British Empire stood completely alone. Licking its wounds after the evacuation of Dunkirk, surviving day by day on merchant convoys crossing the treacherous North Atlantic. In the East, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was a massive, paranoid behemoth, but crucially it was bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. For decades, the ultimate nightmare of the German General Staff was the two-front war. You can trace this paranoia all the way back to Otto von Bismarck, who engineered a complex web of treaties specifically to avoid fighting East and West simultaneously. During World War I, this exact nightmare bled the German Empire dry. The Schlieffen Plan of 1914 was a desperate, mathematically impossible gamble to knock out France before the Russian steamroller could mobilize. It failed, and Germany spent 4 years slowly suffocating in the trenches. Hitler himself wrote extensively about the idiocy of a two-front war. Yet, his ideological obsession with Lebensraum, or living space in the East, and his virulent hatred of Bolshevism ultimately overrode basic military logic. But let us inject a dose of pure, pragmatic realism into the dictator's mind. If you are sitting on a continent practically made of coal and steel, and your only active enemy is an island nation surviving on imported canned beans and aviation fuel, why on earth would you kick down the door of the largest land empire in human history? Why fight a bear in its own cave when you can lock the door and steal the honey from the neighbor? The economic reality of 1941 dictates everything. War is not won by drawing arrows on a map. War is won by moving millions of tons of steel, grain, and oil across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. Germany was an industrial powerhouse, but it possessed a critical, fatal flaw. It lacked domestic petroleum and rubber. The German war machine ran on oil. A single Panzer division, moving just 60 miles, required roughly 12 to 15,000 gallons of fuel. The Luftwaffe consumed thousands of tons of high-octane aviation fuel daily. Germany's domestic synthetic fuel plants, like the massive lunar works, converting coal to liquid fuel through the Bergius process, were engineering marvels. But they could never meet the demands of a total war economy. They needed raw, crude oil. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești provided a vital lifeline, but it was not enough. Here is the brilliant, dark irony of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin was actually feeding the beast that wanted to kill him. Between 1939 and the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union delivered over 900,000 tons of oil, 1.6 million tons of grain, and hundreds of thousands of tons of manganese, chromium, and phosphates to Germany. The Soviet rail network was working overtime to supply the Wehrmacht. If Hitler simply maintains this pact, the British naval blockade, the very same strategy that starved Germany into submission in 1918, becomes completely useless. Think of the Union's Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War, designed to slowly strangle the Confederacy by blocking its ports. Britain's strategy against Germany in 1941 was the Anaconda Plan on a global scale. But an anaconda cannot choke you if you have a massive, open supply line running straight through your back door to the Ural Mountains. By keeping peace with Stalin, Hitler secures his eastern flank and guarantees his resource stream. So, what does the correlation of forces look like if the Eastern Front never opens? Let us look at the terrifying concentration of combat power that would suddenly be freed up to face the West. In our timeline, Operation Barbarossa consumed 152 German divisions. That included 19 Panzer divisions and 15 motorized infantry divisions. We are talking about over 3,000 tanks and assault guns. If we pivot this massive force away from the Russian steppes, the strategic options for the German High Command become almost limitless. Let us break down the hardware and the doctrine. The German army of 1941 was arguably the most operationally effective land force on the planet. They operated on the principle of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, combined with Auftragstaktik, mission command. This was not the rigid, top-down control seen in the Soviet or French armies. German commanders at the battalion and company levels were given an objective and the freedom to achieve it, however they saw fit. It was the same aggressive, decentralized cavalry mindset you saw in Nathan Bedford Forrest or Phil Sheridan during the American Civil War, but mechanized and heavily armored. At the tip of the spear was the Panzer Division. By 1941, the Germans were phasing out the light Panzer I and Sioux tanks, relying heavily on the Panzer III and Panzer IV. Let us look at the Panzer III Ausf J. It weighed 21.5 tons, powered by a 300 horsepower Maybach V12 engine, giving it a top speed of 25 miles per hour on roads. It was armed with a 50mm KWK-38 gun and protected by up to 1.96 inches of frontal armor. It was not the heaviest tank in the world, but it was reliable, ergonomically brilliant, and equipped with a dedicated radio and a 5-man crew. Every tank commander could talk to his platoon, coordinating attacks with lethal precision. Supporting the armor were motorized infantry regiments, towed anti-tank battalions equipped with the 37mm Pak 36, and the legendary 88mm flak gun, originally an anti-aircraft weapon that proved devastatingly effective at punching through heavy armor at ranges exceeding 1 mile. Now imagine throwing the entire weight of this mechanized juggernaut, not into the freezing mud of Russia, but into the Mediterranean theater. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, had actually begged Hitler to adopt the Mediterranean strategy in late 1940. Raeder understood maritime strategy far better than the former infantry corporal. Raeder argued that Britain was an empire built on sea lanes. If you cut the vital artery of the Suez Canal in Egypt and seal the western entrance at Gibraltar, you turn the Mediterranean Sea into an Axis lake. You cut Britain off from the oil of the Middle East and the manpower of India and Australia. Let us analyze the British forces standing in the way. The British Army in the Middle East, commanded by General Archibald Wavell, was a highly professional but severely overstretched force. They relied heavily on imperial troops, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders and South Africans. Their armoured spearheads utilised tanks like the Matilda II. The Matilda was an infantry tank, heavily armoured with up to 3.07 inches of cast steel on the front. It was practically immune to the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun, which German troops bitterly nicknamed the door knocker because it just bounced off. But the Matilda was slow, maxing out at 15 miles per hour, and its 2-pounder gun lacked a high explosive shell, making it vulnerable to entrenched anti-tank screens. In our timeline, Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps arrived in Libya in early 1941 with just 2 divisions, the 15th Panzer and the 5th Light Division. With this tiny force operating at the absolute limit of a fragile supply line stretching hundreds of miles back to Tripoli, Rommel completely destabilized the British position in North Africa. He drove them all the way back to the Egyptian border. Now, ask yourself this. What happens if Rommel doesn't get 2 divisions? What happens if the German High Command, unburdened by a Russian campaign, allocates 10 Panzer divisions and 5 motorized divisions to the Mediterranean? What happens if the Luftwaffe transfers the entirety of Luftflotte 2 and Luftflotte 4, thousands of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Junkers Ju-88 bombers, to bases in Sicily, Libya and Greece? The logistical challenge would be immense, but not insurmountable. The primary bottleneck for the Axis in North Africa was not the amount of supplies they had in Europe. but the shipping capacity across the Mediterranean and the port capacity at Tripoli and Benghazi. The Royal Navy, based out of Alexandria in Egypt and the island of Malta, constantly harassed Axis convoys. But if the Luftwaffe concentrates its entire offensive power over the central Mediterranean, Malta would be pounded into dust. In our timeline, Malta barely survived a partial siege. Under the full, undivided attention of the Luftwaffe, the island would either be starved out or taken by a massive airborne assault. Operation Hercules, executed by Kurt Student's Fallschirmjäger, the same paratroopers who took Crete. Once Malta falls, the Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean become a protected highway. Furthermore, the industrial capacity of Germany, without the massive attrition of the Eastern Front, would undergo a completely different evolution. In 1941, the German war economy was surprisingly inefficient. It was not fully mobilized for total war until Albert Speer took over in 1942. Factories were still operating on single shifts. Consumer goods were still being produced. If Hitler realizes he is in for a long, grinding war of attrition against the British Empire and eventually the United States, he can rationalize his industry earlier. We are talking about millions of skilled German workers who are not drafted to freeze to death outside Moscow. We are talking about thousands of locomotives and tens of thousands of rail cars that are not destroyed by Russian partisans or lost in the snow. This industrial surplus would directly feed the one arena where Germany could actually strike at the heart of the British Empire: the Atlantic Ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic was the only campaign that truly frightened Winston Churchill. Britain required importing over 1 million tons of food and war materials every single week just to survive. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, calculated that he needed 300 U-boats operational to completely sever Britain's supply lines. In 1941, he rarely had more than 30 or 40 at sea at any given time. The Type 7C U-boat was the workhorse of the German fleet. Displacing 769 tons surfaced, it carried 14 torpedoes and an 88mm deck gun. It had a range of 8,500 nautical miles. Donitz's Wolfpack tactics involved spreading a patrol line of submarines across the convoy routes. When one spotted a convoy, it did not attack immediately. It shadowed the ships, sending high-frequency radio signals back to headquarters, which then vectored in half a dozen other U-boats to attack simultaneously at night, on the surface, overwhelming the British escorts. Without the massive drain of tank and artillery production required for the Soviet Union, German shipyards like Blohm and Voss in Hamburg and Germaniawerft in Kiel could have doubled or tripled their U-boat production. Steel, copper, and specialized machine tools that historically went into building Panzer divisions would be redirected into building submarines and long-range maritime patrol aircraft like the Focke-Wulf, FW-200 Condor. By the winter of 1941, the North Atlantic would not just be a danger zone for British merchant shipping. It would be a graveyard. But what about the Soviet Union? A common counter-argument is that if Hitler did not attack Stalin in 1941, Stalin would have attacked Hitler in 1942 or 1943. The Soviet Red Army was undergoing a massive, painful reorganization following Stalin's brutal purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s. 35,000 officers, including brilliant military theorists like Marshall, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the architect of the Soviet deep battle doctrine, had been executed or sent to the Gulag. Deep battle was a revolutionary concept that envisioned attacking the enemy simultaneously throughout the entire depth of their defensive lines, using combined arms to achieve rapid breakthroughs and deep strategic penetrations. It was brilliant on paper, but the officers who understood it were dead. In 1941, the Red Army was a clumsy, top-heavy giant. However, they were producing formidable equipment. The T-34 medium tank was arguably the best tank in the world at that time. Weighing 26 tons, with wide tracks for traversing mud and snow, sloped armor that deflected anti-tank rounds, and a powerful 76.2 mm gun, it was a technological shock to the Germans. Alongside, it was the KV-1 heavy tank, a 45-ton monster, with armor up to 3.5 inches thick. Practically invulnerable to anything but a direct hit from an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. If Stalin is given 2 more years of peace, he relocates his heavy industry behind the Ural Mountains without the chaos of a German invasion. He trains millions of conscripts. He builds tens of thousands of T-34s. But defensively, the border between the German sphere and the Soviet sphere in partitioned Poland was highly defensible. If the Germans are not attacking, they are fortifying, constructing a massive, heavily mined defensive line along the Bug and San rivers, backed by a mobile reserve of Panzer divisions, would create a meat grinder that even a modernized Red Army would struggle to breach. The Germans were masters of defensive warfare, as they proved time and time again during their long retreat from 1943 to 1945. Imagine that same defensive mastery, but with fully supplied, fully manned divisions sitting behind concrete bunkers rather than exhausted remnants fighting in the snow. This brings us to the grand strategic realignment. If the East is a fortified, quiet border and the Atlantic is swarming with U-boats, the entire focus of the European war shifts south. The Mediterranean becomes the decisive theatre. The objective is no longer the conquest of territory for the sake of ideology, but the systematic dismantling of the British Empire's global network. And to do that, the German war machine must execute a series of complex joint operations that will test the limits of their logistics, their naval power, and their diplomatic coercion. The first domino that must fall is a massive rock sitting at the entrance to the Mediterranean, a fortress that has defied sieges for centuries. And its capture requires a tactical masterclass that the German General Staff has already drafted in secret. Operation Felix was the blueprint for the destruction of British naval supremacy in the Mediterranean, and it all centered on 2.6 square miles of solid, imposing limestone, the Rock of Gibraltar, rising 1,400 feet above the sea. This British fortress controlled the narrow 9-mile strait separating Europe from Africa. In our timeline, Adolf Hitler tried to persuade Spanish dictator Francisco Franco to allow German troops to cross Spain and assault Gibraltar. Franco, playing a cautious game, demanded exorbitant colonial concessions and essentially stonewalled the Germans, knowing Hitler was already distracted by his upcoming Russian adventure. But in a world where the Wehrmacht is not marching toward Moscow, the diplomatic calculus shifts violently. Facing an undivided, fully mobilized German war machine sitting on the Pyrenees Mountains, Franco is either bought off with French-Moroccan territory or simply bullied into submission. The German High Command triggers Operation Felix. To crack a fortress like Gibraltar, you do not use standard field artillery. You bring in the monsters. The German siege train would rely heavily on the Karl Gerät, a 600mm self-propelled siege mortar. This was not a weapon of maneuver. It was a mechanical beast weighing 124 tons, moving at a crawling pace of 3 miles per hour on massive tracks. It fired a concrete piercing shell weighing 4,780 pounds. Think about that mass. That is the weight of a modern Ford F-150 pickup truck, packed with high explosives falling from the sky at a terminal velocity designed to shatter reinforced concrete. To move this Leviathan through the rudimentary Spanish railway network required specialized, heavy-duty flat cars and a massive logistical tail just to supply its fuel and ammunition. But once positioned in the hills north of the Spanish border town of La Línea, the Karl Gerät, alongside dozens of 210mm heavy howitzers, would unleash a bombardment unlike anything the British garrison had ever experienced. How do you hold a fortress when the enemy can drop 2-ton, armor-piercing shells onto your subterranean water desalination plants? You simply cannot. The British defence of Gibraltar relied on a vast network of tunnels, over 30 miles of them carved into the rock. It was a subterranean city designed to withstand a siege. But tunnels are only as good as the air you breathe and the water you drink. The German assault doctrine for fortified positions, honed at the Belgian fort of Eben-Emael, relied on blinding the enemy, suppressing their artillery, and systematically dismantling their life support. The attack begins at dawn with the shrieking dive of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas. The Stuka was obsolete in contested airspace, as the Battle of Britain proved, but over Gibraltar, with the Luftwaffe pouring hundreds of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters into the skies from Spanish airfields, the Stukas operate with impunity. Their target is not just the anti-aircraft batteries on the Rock, but the Royal Navy's Force H anchored in the harbour. 1,000-pound armour-piercing bombs tear through the decks of cruisers and destroyers, rendering the naval base entirely untenable. The British fleet is forced to flee into the open Atlantic or the deeper Mediterranean, abandoning the garrison. Then comes the infantry assault. The German 49th Mountain Corps, commanded by General Hubert Lanz, specializes in exactly this kind of vertical, treacherous terrain. These Gebirgsjäger are elite light infantry, equipped with climbing gear, MP-40 submachine guns, and the Flammenwerfer 35 flamethrower. The flamethrower is the ultimate weapon of tunnel warfare. It does not just burn the enemy. It consumes all the oxygen in a confined space, suffocating anyone deep inside the cave systems. The fighting up the steep, scrub-covered slopes of the rock would be a brutal, yard-by-yard slaughter, highly reminiscent of the United States Marine Corps' horrific struggle to clear the Umurbrogel pocket on Peleliu in 1944. It is a slow, agonizing process of blasting pillboxes with satchel charges and roasting tunnel entrances. But isolated, starved of water, and pounded into the bedrock, the Gibraltar garrison inevitably capitulates. The western door to the Mediterranean slams shut. With the Strait of Gibraltar secured, the Axis effectively traps whatever British naval assets remain inside the Mediterranean. But to turn the sea into a secure logistical highway for the Afrika Korps, the Luftwaffe must eliminate the unsinkable aircraft carrier sitting directly astride the supply routes between Italy and Libya. The island of Malta. In 1942, the Axis planned Operation Hercules, a massive airborne and amphibious invasion of Malta, but cancelled it because Rommel promised he could take Egypt without it, and Hitler was terrified of another airborne slaughter like the one he suffered on the island of Crete. But with no Eastern Front draining his resources and his patience, Hitler green-lights Hercules. Let us analyze the tip of the Axis spear for this operation. The Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers. Unlike American airborne doctrine, which had paratroopers jumping with their main weapons, the German Fallschirmjäger jumped armed only with pistols and perhaps a few grenades. Their rifles, submachine guns, and MG-34 machine guns were dropped separately in weapons canisters. This was a fatal design flaw in their parachute harness, which attached at a single point on the back, forcing the jumper into a face-down position that made carrying heavy gear dangerous upon landing. On Crete, this resulted in hundreds of paratroopers being gunned down while frantically searching for their weapon canisters in the olive groves. But Student and the Airborne Command learned from Crete. For Malta, the doctrine is modified. They rely heavily on the DFS 230 assault glider. This silent, unpowered aircraft could carry 9 fully armed troops and pilot, or heavy equipment like the 75mm recoilless rifle. Towed behind a Ju-52 transport, the glider could be released miles from the target, silently gliding in to land directly on top of British anti-aircraft positions or the crucial airfields at Tarkali and Hal Far. The terrain of Malta is unforgiving. It is a dry, rocky island crisscrossed by low stone walls. Glider landings would be violent, with high casualty rates just from crashing into the terraced fields. Yet the sheer volume of the assault overwhelms the defenders. Imagine the sky darkening with 500 Ju-52 transports, dropping thousands of paratroopers in a single wave, while Italian naval infantry storm the rocky beaches of Marsaxlokk Bay. The British garrison comprised of battle-hardened infantry like the Royal West Kents, fights of vicious urban defence in the narrow, winding streets of Valletta. But without hope of a relief convoy, because Gibraltar is gone and the Royal Navy cannot run the gauntlet of Stukas, Malta bleeds out. When the swastika is raised over the Grand Harbour, the Mediterranean is officially an Axis lake. Now we shift our focus to the sands of North Africa, where the logistical leash on Erwin Rommel has just been completely removed. In reality, Rommel was a master tactician, but a strategic nightmare. He constantly outran his supply lines, pushing his panzers until they literally ran dry in the desert. The British Eighth Army did not defeat Rommel with superior tactics. They defeated him with superior logistics and the sheer weight of American-supplied material. But what happens when the port of Tripoli is receiving 10 times the amount of shipping? What happens when the German quartermasters are not begging for fuel that is being diverted to Army Group Center in Russia? We have to look at a micro-logistical masterpiece that gave the German motorized infantry a massive advantage in the desert. The Wehrmachtskanister, known to the Allies as the jerrycan. It seems trivial, but wars are won on such margins. The jerrycan held 5.3 gallons of fuel. It was stamped from 2 pieces of steel, featuring an X-shaped indentation on the sides that allowed the metal to expand and contract in the extreme desert heat without rupturing. It had 3 handles, meaning one man could carry 2 full cans or pass them efficiently in a bucket brigade. It had a cam-lever lid that provided an airtight seal and a built-in spout. No funnel required. Compare this to the British standard fuel container, the infamous 4-gallon flimsy. The flimsy was made of thin tin plate. It was poorly soldered. In the brutal, bouncing environment of a supply truck, driving off-road over the rocky Libyan desert, the flimsies would split at the seams. It is estimated that the British Eighth Army lost up to 30% of its fuel to leakage before it ever reached the front lines. The fuel pooled in the truck beds, creating massive fire hazards. When you are operating hundreds of miles from your base, a 30% fuel loss is the difference between a successful flanking maneuver and your tanks becoming stationary steel coffins. With secure shipping across the Mediterranean and the efficiency of the jerrycan, Rommel's Panzer Army Africa is fully fueled, fully watered, and heavily reinforced. Let us dissect the armoured clash that decides the fate of Egypt. The British rely heavily on the Crusader tank. The Crusader is fast, capable of hitting 27 miles per hour, making it excellent for the sweeping naval-style manoeuvres of desert warfare. But it is plagued by fatal flaws. Its Liberty engine is notoriously unreliable, prone to overheating and throwing fan belts in the sand. More importantly, its armour is thin, maxing out at 2 inches, and its main armament is the 2-pounder gun. The 2-pounder is a pure anti-tank weapon. It fires a solid armour-piercing slug, but it has no high explosive shell. This means a Crusader tank cannot effectively engage a German anti-tank gun hidden behind a sand dune. It can only fire a solid bullet at a tiny target. Rommel understands this weakness perfectly. His doctrine does not involve sending his panzers charging into enemy tanks like a cavalry melee. That is a British mistake. Rommel uses his panzers as bait. He pushes his armour forward, kicks up a massive dust cloud, and draws the British cruiser tanks into a charge. As the Crusaders race across the desert, the German panzers suddenly halt, reverse, and pull back through gaps in a pre-established screen of anti-tank guns. The backbone of this screen is the legendary 88mm Flak 36. Originally designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers, the Germans quickly realized that its high muzzle velocity, 2,690 feet per second, made it the deadliest tank killer on the battlefield. The 88 can comfortably destroy a British tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. In the shimmering heat haze of the desert, the British tank commanders cannot even see the low-profile German guns before their turrets are blown off. It is a tactical slaughter. The British armoured brigades charge into the invisible wall of high-velocity steel, shattering like Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, broken by massed, disciplined fire before they ever reach the German infantry. With his supply lines secure and his armoured spearheads heavily reinforced by Panzer IV F2s, equipped with the long-barreled 75mm gun that can outrange anything the British possess, Rommel shatters the defensive line at El Alamein. There is no desperate British stand. The sheer weight of German air superiority, with hundreds of Ju-88 bombers pounding the British rear areas, prevents General Bernard Montgomery from organizing a coherent defense. The Afrika Korps bypasses the coastal road, hooking deep through the Katara Depression, a logistical feat made possible only by the massive influx of half-tracks and fuel from a peaceful Europe. The fall of Alexandria triggers a strategic collapse. The British Mediterranean fleet is forced to scuttle its remaining vessels or run the suicidal gauntlet down the Suez Canal. Cairo falls. The swastika is raised over the pyramids of Giza. But the ultimate prize is not the symbolic capture of Egypt. It is the jugular vein of the British Empire, the Suez Canal. By capturing the canal intact, or even blocking it with sunken ships, the Axis completely severs Britain from its shortest route to India, Malaya, and Australia. British reinforcements and raw materials must now travel all the way around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, adding thousands of miles and weeks of transit time to every convoy, exposing them to the growing wolf packs of German U-boats operating in the South Atlantic. But the German war machine does not stop at the Red Sea. The geopolitical center of gravity now shifts to the Middle East. The objective is the very lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare: oil. With the Soviet Union neutral, Germany is receiving Russian oil. But Hitler knows he cannot rely on Stalin forever. He needs his own independent, limitless supply, and it sits just across the Sinai Peninsula. Moving an army across the Sinai and into the Levant is a logistical nightmare of a different order. The temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and there is no shade. The fine, powdery sand gets into everything. It acts like grinding paste, inside the cylinders of the Maybach tank engines. The Germans have to rapidly adapt their equipment, fitting massive, specialized air filters to their vehicles, a technology they historically struggled to perfect in North Africa. The infantry suffers from dysentery, heat stroke, and blinding sandstorms known as the Kamsin, which can ground the Luftwaffe for days and reduce visibility to zero. Yet the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East in 1941 and 42 is highly volatile and ripe for exploitation. The British hold mandates over Palestine and Iraq, and the Free French nominally control Syria and Lebanon. But Arab nationalism is boiling over. In our timeline, the British had to put down a pro-Axis coup in Iraq in 1941, the Golden Square Rebellion, with Rommel sitting in Cairo, appearing as an invincible conqueror driving out the British colonial masters. The psychological impact across the Arab world is seismic. German motorized columns, supported by airborne drops, push north into Jerusalem and Damascus. The British forces in the region, starved of reinforcements, are easily swept aside or forced into long, fighting retreats toward the Persian Gulf. The ultimate strategic targets are the massive oil fields at Kirkuk in Iraq and the Abadan refinery in Iran, one of the largest oil refineries in the world at the time. Securing these facilities intact requires precision. The British will attempt to sabotage the wellheads and burn the refineries before retreating. This necessitates rapid, deep penetration strikes by the Brandenburgers, German special forces who specialize in operating behind enemy lines, often in captured uniforms, to secure vital infrastructure before it can be destroyed. Imagine a daring, midnight glider assault on the Abadan refinery, a desperate firefight amidst towering distillation columns and miles of highly flammable pipelines, securing the facility just hours before the British demolition teams can trigger their charges. Once the Axis secures the Iraqi and Iranian oil, the strategic equation of the entire war is fundamentally rewritten. Germany is no longer a blockaded, resource-starved continental power. It is a transcontinental empire with an infinite supply of the high-octane fuel needed to power a global navy and an expanded Luftwaffe. The British Empire is effectively cut in half, bleeding out in the Atlantic, isolated in the home islands, and watching its Asian colonies fall to the expanding Japanese Empire. Winston Churchill sits in the underground cabinet war rooms in London, staring at a map of the world that has turned almost entirely hostile. The Mediterranean is closed, the Middle East is lost. The U-boats are sinking merchant ships faster than British and Canadian shipyards can build them. The mathematics of survival are failing. Britain cannot win this war alone. They cannot even hold the line much longer. The entire hope of the free world now rests on a single, fragile premise: the industrial might and the manpower of a nation separated by 3,000 miles of submarine-infested ocean. The British are out of moves, out of time and out of blood, waiting desperately for the sleeping giant to fully awaken and hurl its massive industrial weight into the meat grinder of a radically different global conflict. The sleeping giant does eventually awaken. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor still happens. The United States is thrust into a two-front war of its own. But the strategic calculus in Washington is fundamentally altered. In our timeline, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed on a Europe-first strategy, banking heavily on the Soviet Union to absorb the vast majority of the Wehrmacht's blunt force trauma. But in this alternate reality, there is no meat grinder in the East. The Red Army is sitting quietly behind the Ural Mountains. The United States is now staring across the Atlantic Ocean at a fortress continent, defended by an undivided, fully supplied, undefeated German military machine. How does the United States project power against this behemoth? The only immediate weapon available to strike the European mainland is strategic bombing. Enter the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Let us look at the B-17G model. It was a four-engine heavy bomber carrying a payload of 4,000 pounds on long-range missions, bristling with 1350 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The American doctrine relied on the combat box formation, a tight, mutually supporting aerial phalanx designed to create a dome of defensive fire. But doctrine often dies in the freezing air at 25,000 feet. Can a formation of heavy bombers, no matter how heavily armed, survive an airspace defended by an enemy that isn't bleeding out on another front? The answer is written in the aluminum wreckage that would rain down over Germany. In our timeline, the 8th Air Force suffered horrific casualties until the introduction of the long-range P-51 Mustang escort fighter. Now, imagine a Luftwaffe that has not lost thousands of experienced pilots and aircraft over the Russian steppes. General Adolf Hitler, commanding the German fighter arm, has the industrial backing to field thousands of Focke-Wulf FW-190 interceptors. He has the resources to accelerate the Messerschmitt Me-262 program. The Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. Powered by two Jumo 004 turbojets, it could hit 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang. Armed with 430mm Mk108 cannons, a single burst could tear the wing off a B-17. Against a fully concentrated Luftwaffe, the American daylight bombing campaign would not just be costly, it would be suicidal. It would heavily resemble the catastrophic losses of the British at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where wave after wave of infantry walked directly into massed machine gun fire. But this time, the slaughter happens in the stratosphere. The prerequisite for any American ground campaign in Europe is winning the Battle of the Atlantic. But Admiral Karl Donitz now commands a U-boat fleet backed by a massive surplus of steel and shipyard capacity. The U-boats are not just the standard Type 7s anymore. The Germans accelerate the deployment of the Type 21 Elektroboot. This was a revolutionary submarine. Unlike earlier U-boats, which were essentially surface ships that could briefly submerge to attack or hide, the Type 21 was designed to operate entirely underwater. It had massive battery banks, a streamlined hull, and could travel silently submerged at 17 knots, faster than the Allied corvettes and frigates trying to hunt it. The Allied hunter-killer groups, using high-frequency direction finding and airborne radar, would face an enemy that simply did not need to surface to charge its batteries. The Atlantic crossing becomes a logistical nightmare, reminiscent of the catastrophic supply failures the British suffered during the American Revolution, where the vast ocean distance and hostile privateers crippled their ability to sustain an army in the 13 colonies. The intelligence war becomes the absolute center of gravity. At Bletchley Park, Alan Turing and the Allied codebreakers are reading German Enigma traffic through the Ultra program. But intelligence is only useful if you have the physical means to act on it. Knowing exactly where a U-boat Wolfpack is waiting does not help if you do not have enough destroyers to route the convoy safely around them. Furthermore, without the massive intelligence hauls captured by the Soviets on the Eastern Front, such as intact codebooks from overrun headquarters, Bletchley Park faces a much darker, much more opaque intelligence picture. Let us assume the United States, through sheer brute force industrial output, builds enough Liberty ships to finally bridge the Atlantic and sustain an army in Britain. The ultimate objective remains the liberation of Europe. Operation Overlord, D-Day. But D-Day in 1944 was only possible because 80% of the German army was being actively annihilated by the Soviets. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France, had a hodgepodge of depleted divisions, teenage conscripts, and static coastal defense units. What happens when the landing craft ramps drop on Omaha Beach, and they are not facing second-rate garrison troops, but the elite, fully rested, fully equipped divisions of the Waffen-SS and the regular Wehrmacht? Rommel's Atlantic Wall is not a half-finished propaganda project in this timeline. It is a continuous, deeply layered defensive belt stretching from Norway to Spain. The beaches are saturated with telemines, Czech hedgehogs, and Belgian gates. Behind the concrete bunkers, housing deadly MG-42 machine guns, firing 1,200 rounds a minute, sit not just a few scattered Panzer divisions, but dozens of them. Imagine facing the Panzer Lehr Division or the 1st SS Panzer Division, equipped with the formidable Panzer Phi Panther. The Panther weighed 45 tons, featured heavily sloped frontal armor, and mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun that could punch right through the frontal armor of an American M4 Sherman tank at 2,000 yards. An amphibious assault against a fully fortified, undivided German continent would make the bloodbath of Tarawa in the Pacific look like a minor skirmish. When the United States Marines hit the beaches of Tarawa in 1943, they faced 4,500 entrenched Japanese defenders, and it cost over 1,000 American lives in just 3 brutal days. A continental invasion against a fully manned Wehrmacht would be Tarawa multiplied by 1,000. The casualty projections would force the Joint Chiefs of Staff to reconsider the entire concept of a ground invasion. It would be a mathematical impossibility to secure a beachhead before German operational reserves rushed in by rail to crush the lodgment and push the Americans back into the English Channel. This brings us to the ultimate terrifying endgame. If conventional military victory in Europe is impossible, the war shifts entirely to the realm of weapons of mass destruction. The Manhattan Project, led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, was a massive industrial and scientific gamble, costing $2 billion and employing over 130,000 people. Its singular goal was to build the atomic bomb before Nazi Germany did. In our timeline, the German nuclear program, the Uran project, led by Werner Heisenberg, was fractured, underfunded, and crippled by the loss of brilliant Jewish physicists who fled the regime. But in a timeline where Germany is not fighting for its life in the freezing ruins of Stalingrad, where Albert Speer has fully mobilized the economies of a dozen conquered European nations, the resources allocated to the Uran project could be vastly expanded. Germany had access to uranium ore from the Joachimsthal mines in Czechoslovakia. They had heavy water from the Vemork plant in Norway. If Hitler realizes the war with America is a permanent conventional stalemate, he pours billions of Reichsmarks into the nuclear program. Does the world end in the 1940s, not with a single flash over Hiroshima, but with a transatlantic exchange of atomic fire? The Germans were already pioneering ballistic missiles. The V-2 rocket, designed by Wernher von Braun, was a liquid propellant missile that travelled at supersonic speeds, plunging from the edge of space to strike London without warning. There was no defence against it, and the V-2 was just the beginning. The German design bureaus were actively working on the A-9, A-10 Amerika Rakete, a massive two-stage intercontinental ballistic missile designed to strike New York City from launch pads in Europe. If you marry a primitive atomic warhead to an intercontinental ballistic missile, the geographical isolation of the United States vanishes instantly. The conclusion to this alternate reality is grim and deeply unsettling. If Adolf Hitler had maintained the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and never invaded the Soviet Union, the Third Reich would not have been defeated by conventional means. The British Empire would have been suffocated and dismantled, losing the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and its vital supply lines. The United States, despite its unparalleled industrial capacity, would have found itself facing an impenetrable fortress Europe. A cross-channel invasion would have been a catastrophic failure against an undivided Wehrmacht. The geopolitical landscape would have frozen into a terrifying, multipolar Cold War decades earlier than ours. It would closely mirror the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s, but far more unstable. You would have an American hemisphere, a Japanese empire dominating the Pacific, a neutral but heavily armed Soviet Union, and a Nazi empire dominating Europe and the Middle East. The war would not end with a signing ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri. It would end in a tense, paranoid armistice, with both Washington and Berlin pointing atomic-tipped rockets at each other across the Atlantic Ocean, waiting for the other to blink. History is not shaped by destiny, but by the fatal miscalculations of arrogant men, And Hitler's ideological obsession with the East was the very blunder that saved the Western world from 1,000-year darkness. The ultimate lesson of warfare is that logistics and geography will always ruthlessly punish those who let ideology override basic strategic arithmetic. How do you think an undivided German war machine would have impacted the atomic race? The US still builds the bomb first and nukes Berlin to end the war. B. Germany develops the bomb simultaneously, leading to a 1940s Cold War standoff. C. The German nuclear program remains flawed by ideology, and the US wins through a negotiated peace. Let me know your choice and your reasoning down in the comments.